Hello and welcome to Tête-à-Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest this week is James Elder. He's the global spokesperson for UNICEF. UNICEF is the United Nations Children's Fund, and he joins us from Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. Thank you very much, Mr. Elder, for being on our show.
Hi there, Mark. Pleasure.
So you are in Beirut. You've visited areas targeted by bombardments in Beirut, but also in the south of Lebanon. Tell us what you saw, especially about children in those conditions.
Yeah, look, Mark, I think in the most simple sense, life here has just been turned upside down for people. It's bleak. There's been so much death, so much destruction, of homes, but also this time there was something different in all of these attacks. There's been so much around that critical infrastructure that girls and boys rely on. So whether it's water, or whether it's schools or hospitals. I was in a hospital yesterday. It's a big hospital serving huge areas in the south, but it's empty because everyone has fled from there. So, you've got hundreds of thousands of children are displaced. I think, Mark, when we talk of displacement, it can sound like it's very neutral and soft. It's not. It's violent. It's repetitious. So you've got hundreds of thousands of children waking up in a classroom, but not going to school. And I think ultimately, whilst there is a ceasefire, and we hope it holds in a truly meaningful sense, people are just so rattled here. And a lot of that comes back to what's happened in the last 6 weeks, but particularly on the 8th of April, just over 2 weeks ago, Mark, there was 100 airstrikes in less than 10 minutes. Dozens of children killed across the country. And I think talking to many, many Lebanese, it just gave them a sense that there really is nowhere safe. And their great fear is that moments like that, so long as impunity continues, moments like that can be repeated.
Right. Israel says it is targeting Hezbollah militants, Hezbollah infrastructure, but from what you've witnessed on the ground, clearly civilians and especially children have been also targeted. And in the south, we've also seen Israel push out a population from what it calls a sterile zone in the south of the country.
Well, exactly. So when you see schools destroyed, yesterday I was in a hospital and there was a missile hole in the hospital. So unfortunately, the reality on the ground, the evidence, the only thing we speak to all the time does make it say something very different to those statements we hear. At the same time, you rightly point to now the area of southern Lebanon where people can't go home to. Yesterday, Mark, I sat with a father in a shelter. UNICEF, we're always about the children, of course, because they are the most vulnerable. But I keep encountering a lot of dads, and this father, he's from the south, and in September 2024, in those round of attacks, he had his cattle killed. He borrowed around 40,000 euro to buy more cattle. He's just learned that they had all been killed, and he was showing me the video of his home being bulldozed by the Israeli forces at the same time while his crops were destroyed. So he's got nothing to go back to. And this is one of the great sadnesses for people. They will push through, they will persevere, communities will rally around one another as they so often do. But if your home has been turned into rubble and your crops destroyed, then people just need support.
Right. There's been a lot of talk about a lost generation in Syria for the last 10 years. In Gaza, the argument could be made. Is there a risk that it could also happen in Lebanon? Because Lebanon, for the past several years, has been essentially a battlefield on and off. But for children, I guess it means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, so all those areas you mentioned, education is such a primary passion of parents and grandparents. Everyone goes to whatever lengths they can to keep their children learning. And it's why in a place like Lebanon, when people get a moment to rebound, they do. It's not a cliche. They do because of that education level, because they are engineers, because they are nurses, they are doctors, they will work and work. But as you rightly say, if we go from COVID, of children having years online, as all of your audiences will have experienced, the turmoil that meant for children and families. Then, of course, there was the port explosion. Then there was the war of September 2024. And now there's this. So that's an enormous amount. We have to understand the toll that takes on education, on trauma. I don't think people are giving enough attention. You know, the trauma that's happening to children here, that doesn't stop when the bombs stop. You know, this is not in the abstract. Biologically, we know when children are exposed to such constant levels of violence, it has an impact. Has an impact on how they grow, on how they learn, on how they love, on how they will become parents themselves. That's something UNICEF is trying to address. Remarkable things I see here. I have to say, it's not just our work in education. We do a lot of work in trauma. We do work on the physical side, Mark, where any child that comes into a hospital who needs specialised care, we will ensure every single operation is covered for. That makes a sizable difference. As does, I'm just coming now from a youth program, seeing what lengths youth will go to. They're all young people. They've all been displaced. They're all now staying in schools and shelters, but UNICEF is teaching them. They're cooking, they're sewing, because when people leave their homes, when they flee at that moment, they often leave without bedding, without clothes. So they're sewing sleeping bags, they're sewing clothes. So they learn skills, they give back to their community, and we pay them for that. So, you know, this is what young people want to do. They want their agency, they want to help their community, and then they get their income. So people are so ready to step up, but as long as the impunity continues for the sheer level of the attacks and the indiscriminate nature of the attacks, then they're always somehow behind.
You mentioned Gaza. I know you went there. There's less talk, obviously, in the media, I guess Western media mostly, about Gaza. Has the situation improved since hostilities on a large scale have stopped, or is it something that needs more attention and that continues to worry you?
It's a great question, Mark, and it's both those things. Things have, of course, improved because before the ceasefire, there was engineered starvation. There was a famine in an area that was 5 miles or 5 kilometers from support. There was a famine, and there had also been tens of thousands of children killed, tens of thousands of girls and boys. No one disagrees with those numbers anymore. So that's a benchmark that we hope history will never repeat. So things have improved, but not to any level that is acceptable for families, for children, for what they need. For example, in the 6 months of the ceasefire, around 215 girls and boys have been killed. 3 children were killed 2 days ago. So 215 children killed during a ceasefire. If you had 215 children killed in any European nation over 6 months, it would be dominating the news. So there's that. There is then, of course, the sheer devastation to infrastructure, 90% damage or destruction to hospitals, same to schools. These are mind-boggling numbers, but they mean that your health system can't recover. So we still have great challenges when it comes to sanitation, water, all the basics that people need. And in Gaza, all the basics that people had. UNICEF gets hundreds of thousands of children back to school. Again, that focus, that passion Palestinians put towards education. But we know we haven't covered all the children. So there's an enormous amount to do. There are still great restrictions. Israel controls now more than 50% of Gaza. So people are crammed into an even smaller space. Most of them still live in tents. For people that lived in homes, many of them had holiday homes, to be in a tent for 2 years, it's the privacy, it's the dignity, it's simply the safety and the sanitation. So there is an enormous amount to do. And unfortunately, yes, the ceasefire hasn't stopped the killing of children, but it has largely taken the world's attention away from what's happening to civilians there.
More broadly, obviously, UNICEF is also acting in other places. We could speak about Sudan, Haiti, DRC, and so on. The list goes on. The problem is that Western countries, first and foremost the United States, is cutting funds for global aid, but also for UN agencies. So UNICEF, as others, is struggling with a huge funding gap. And so what consequences does it have for children all across the globe?
Horrific consequences. We're seeing an existential, one of the existential crisis right now. It's 2 sides of the same moral retreat, if you will. On one hand, we see international humanitarian law, the benchmark that the world agreed, the baseline, the floor, not the ceiling, in terms of the basics that the world would agree to in terms of protection of children and civilians in war. They're being abandoned, and at the same time, we're seeing these funding cuts. So Yeah, in Sudan, when I talked to a nurse who's worked for 6 months without being paid because, as she says, this is my community, I have to keep coming. But she just doesn't understand why, the supplies or at least a financial incentive has disappeared. The pediatrician who walks through gang areas in Haiti, but then gets to a clinic and doesn't have the malnutrition supplies that she needs. So it's an existential funding crisis for children, to be honest. There was a funding crisis globally, 2007, 8, 9, the financial crisis, and the world bailed out the banks. Mark, no one is bailing out the children. Now, UNICEF, we are 100% donor funded, and we have to find ways to meet these families, to give them the support they need, give them that simple leg up, our partners, our doctors, and of course the children. But we must be honest that it can't be done. So when you can't reach everyone when you start seeing these massive funding cuts. I was with a pregnant woman in a shelter yesterday, and she's explaining she's only getting one meal a day. That's because there's not been enough funding for the type of food and rations that people need. We see that in refugee camps, as you say. We're seeing that in Sudan. No one questions the generosity of European governments, of the United States government in years gone by, and of mums and dads. UNICEF relies on mums and dads and families across Europe. But we are at a moment whereby everyone needs to rally around, and we're not talking huge amounts of money. We're talking fractions of amounts of money, particularly when we compare it to the amount spent on war. So I think it's a critical time, because those people who need, they're not waiting around for support. They do everything they possibly can in the face of so many violations. But they are at a point where they need that support, and they do not understand why the rug has been pulled out from under them.
James Elder, thank you very much for being our guest on France 24, and thank you all for watching this edition of Tête à Tête.